For most intellectuals, Ray Kurzweil needs no introduction. From an early age, the young Kurzweil displayed an affinity for science, as well as a desire to have a positive impact on humanity. Much achievement came to be expected from him, and he went on to fulfill these expectations and to become an influential figure in the fields of science and technology. In 2005, Kurzweil captured the imagination of the world with his inspiring vision of a rapidly developing future. The central premise of his book, The Singularity is Near, is as shocking as the fact that the premise itself appears to be supported by the evidence that is readily available. And according to his book, humanity is soon in for one wild ride. It is not our intention to imply herein that Kurzweil is entirely wrong. Indeed, there is an element of impatience and boldness in his work that is admirable and entirely human. Most can agree that it would be fantastic to witness the neo-human era explode into existence before our very eyes. Striving for ideals has always been a key driving factor of human innovation. But the human imagination receives benefit from the reality checks and course corrections periodically given by the actual state of affairs. The essence of our objection is one of false positives. Strictly speaking, we know that past repetitions are no absolute guarantee of future outcomes. We can recall or invoke David Hume's problem of induction, but more to the point, we will call into question Kurzweil's implicit assumption of the nature and complexity of reality. Our method leads to the proposition that though our development may eventually reach the levels Kurzweil envisions, the approach may not be a direct one, but that of the approach towards a limit. Kurzweil makes a case for the singularity premise by lumping together various forms of growth, including key points in the evolution of life and so-called paradigm shifts in human culture and technology, as well as Moore's law. Instead of plotting key events over time, he tends to favor using the inverse, a sort of terminating logarithmic model by plotting the time between events to the time before present. He uses a logarithmic scale for the dependent variable, which automatically causes the graph to bend, though for some reason he refers to this graph as linear. He does not depict the true linear graph, which is nothing more than a y equals negative x line, with data points becoming increasingly closer together along the line. In terms of key events over time, it is clear that the corresponding model is exponential, and from this it is implied, for the natural exponential function at least, that the singularity is the point in time for which the slope of this curve is equal to 1, which occurs at t equals 0. The evidence presented may make Kurzweil's premise that the frequency of events will continue to speed up seem reasonable and a natural consequence. However, there is another model that fits this same data but which gives a completely different forecast, and that is the logistic function, which behaves exponentially until reaching the inflection point at x equals 0. Our premise is that the singularity, contrary to being championed as a point of runaway development, may be nothing more than the point in time for which the rate of development achieves its maximum, after which point in time development will begin to behave logarithmically. In this figure, we see a depiction of the rebound effect. In the logistic model, speeding up towards inflection gives us the momentum, so to speak, to rebound and scale the latter half of developmental curvature. We note that on a log scale of time, we can always take on negative exponents and still remain above the x-axis, which in Kurzweil's original graph is not displayed, presumably to obscure the fact that the x-axis cannot actually be reached with this log scaling, aside from being poorly defined. If we allow the present to touch the x-axis, then we must assign a negative time value to any key events after present that continue to speed up, but this is incoherent because the time between two events must always be non-negative. So we know that the present must lie above the x-axis, but how much farther above? In order for key events to be happening instantaneously, matter must move at the speed of light, which requires infinite energy. We just can't find the next key event in the same instant as the previous key event. If we did, then time would have to stop in order for no events to occur on the timeline beyond the singularity point. Terence McKenna used to claim that time was speeding up as it approached the eschaton or the concrescence. But it is not time, it's the events that occur in time that are speeding up in frequency. He's also credited with saying that time is how much change you can fit into a second. So he seems to have had an intuitive, if somewhat conflicted understanding of time conservation, which you can learn more about in my video, How I Resolved Time Dilation. But, if anything, time would appear to be slowing down around us relative to passive observers if we were to suddenly converge on this mythic critical mass of development. The universe itself may be able to create black holes, but this doesn't necessarily imply that the same is possible, or at least as likely, in the development of life. In systems that are not true fractals, but only fractal-like, we should not be surprised by symmetry breaking between orders of magnitude or levels of complexity. And so we are faced with two mutually exclusive possibilities. Either the universe is infinitely complex and there are an infinite number of developments to be made, or the universe is only finitely complex, in which case there are only a finite number of developments that can be made. If the universe is infinitely complex, then a singularity of development would seem to be the only way to achieve infinite development. But if the universe is only finitely complex, then exponential growth can be called into question on a logistical basis. And we will define infinite complexity as an infinite set of non-repeating laws and/or structural blueprints that occur in a finite correspondence at each level of reality. We say that finite complexity in nature supports logistic development, and we use the word supports as it is weaker than requires or implies, if for no other reason than for our position to be more resilient to objection. Consider the growth of bacteria. If the food supply is infinite, then growth will continue exponentially. But if the food supply is finite, then at a certain point this becomes a stress factor which causes bacterial growth to eventually slow down and approach the maximum population as a limit. The complexity in nature is the food supply, as it were, for human development. And if there is only a limited supply, then the exponential rate of development will not be able to withstand the stress factor of having only a limited number of discoveries remaining. The jury seems out on a determination of infinite or finite complexity in nature, but for the sake of argument, we will assume finite complexity until considering complications directly. The key to understanding the difference between the two models is in understanding the derivatives. The derivative of the natural exponential function is of course itself, but the graph of the derivative of the logistic function is a bell curve, and this allows us to visualize the rate of development over time. We use the Easter egg analogy to hopefully make this concept more accessible. As with any model, there may be some minor deviation in practice, however the general dynamic is as follows. A finite number of eggs are hidden prior to the hunt, say 100 eggs. The hunt begins with 0 eggs located and ends when all the eggs have been acquired. We can construct a hexagram by partitioning the hunt into equal time intervals. As the hunt progresses, the rate of egg acquisition increases, achieving a maximum rate of 1/4 around the time that half the eggs have been found. 1/4 is the value of f prime evaluated at 0. For our model, this implies a maximum developmental rate of 1/4 at inflection. After inflection, in the analogy, Easter eggs begin taking longer to locate, as only the most well-hidden eggs remain, and generally the hunt culminates with the finding of the golden egg, which is the most important and the most difficult of all to locate, the true eschaton. The logistic function has the characteristic that its derivative can be expressed as the original function times the complement, and this results from the fact that the function is a variation of the natural exponential function. Again, the difference is in the derivatives. Though we connect discrete events to form a continuous curve, discretization is the more accurate interpretation. Otherwise, it becomes difficult to distinguish events for counting. And this correspondence with reality in the discrete version of the logistic function gives us more information about developmental curvature than the continuous version. So we have an input x sub n, which gives an output x sub n plus 1, and then the process is repeated, producing a set of discrete points in the plane. Output values depend on the value of input development, and even more so upon the value of the assimilation ratio k, the value and definition of which are open to adjustment, but in general k speaks to the state of development. Suffice it to say that the most efficacious interpretation of k is a subject in itself. The logistic map in this context gives us a way to model the chaotic nature of the future. The logistic map predicts not one, but a virtually infinite number of possible future paths between the lower and upper limits. Limit breaking in this context is a consequence of the fact that the discrete map behaves differently from its continuous counterpart, and in fact, Kurzweil's singularity curve, the abrupt eschatological curve itself, is really a member curve of the logistic map generated by introducing a large enough k value, i.e., k sufficiently greater than 4. The map reveals stable plateaus, which we refer to as the demonic levels, because they do not embody the path that leads to unity or concrescence, but merely a stable path. Morally, we will say that no matter how difficult the path of discovery may become, we should never settle for a current state of affairs, no matter how satisfactory we find them to be. One complication is that development in most cases appears to unfold a bit more chaotically than would seem reasonable, but if k is not restricted to a constant value at each input, which seems reasonable given the working definition, we could lessen the occurrence of unaccounted drops in development in the model that are not represented in reality. Further complications arise when we attempt to predict when the inflection point will occur. It's not something we can easily see coming, but as the frequency of events increases, the sooner we will notice a decrease in frequency if and when it occurs. But it's difficult to project the halfway point of development because it's impossible for us to have foreknowledge of 100% development. Regrettably, and for this reason, the logistic map, while informative, is impotent in terms of actually calculating developmental curvature, since x sub n is defined in terms of total development. So we need to look for another way to track developmental curvature that does not invoke an unknown variable. Before returning to this problem, we will make some other considerations, beginning with symmetry in curvature. Symmetry in developmental curvature refers to conservation in the rate of development, with the rate taking off from rest in the minimum developmental state, passing through developmental space, crossing a stable equilibrium of relatively high development, as we saw, and then slowly returning to rest in the state of maximal development. There can be asymmetry in the shape of the curve and in the initial and final height, as long as the initial and final velocity are equal in the case from minimum to maximum development. We could think about the parabolic motion of a ball thrown under the acceleration of gravity, colliding with the ground and then rebounding. However, the rolling ball analogy is more accurate because the global continuity of curvature reflects that of the logistic derivative, rather than that of a rebounding parabolic arc that is not differentiable at inflection. Just remember, the inflection point is a point of gradual slowing of the frequency of key events, unnoticeable in the moment it occurs. So what is a key event? A key event is a development that unlocks new levels of development. And so when a key event happens, it is really an unlocking event that opens the door to new levels of complexity. The definition of key events must remain vague or arbitrary so that no new and unforeseen key events are excluded from the definition. But at the same time, it needs to be capable of identifying events that do not qualify as key. And so key events are simply those events, whatever their nature may be, that undeniably raise the level of novelty or complexity in a system by replacing a less efficient way of doing things. Take communication, for example. When the telephone was invented, it replaced carrier pigeons, signal fires, etc., and rapidly improved our ability to communicate and to share real-time information. When we look at development closely, from one key event to the next, the general developmental curve should contain S-curvature, sort of like a smoothed-out step function, with development after each key event bounding up and approaching the next key event logarithmically. If we like, we can consider the logistic function with its acceleration curve, or second derivative. When we do this, it becomes evident that the acceleration of development will begin slowing down prior to the speed and will go negative the moment the speed of development begins to slow down. In our survey of development, there are still a few things that need to be mentioned. Firstly, we must draw a distinction between raw events and key events. Raw events and key events can happen on any size scale. They can be nuclear or chemical interactions, the discovery of Pluto, a wedding, the invention of alternating current, etc. Now, there are claims that raw events are occurring exponentially, but it could be that they are simply increasing. They seem to be unbounded above, at least as long as the age of the universe is unbounded, and may continue exponentially for the time being. However, key events are taken to be a finite subset of raw events, using the definition previously given. Admittedly, treating the evolution of life as possibly the first key event doesn't quite fit our definition of a key event because there is no inefficient system to replace. But that is assuming the classical perspective of life and non-life. If consciousness is inherent in nature, then perhaps the first key event can be salvaged without too much difficulty. We hope to clearly show the connection between the time between key events and the rate of development, both as functions of time. Beginning with the former, we start with a sequence of key events before the present, increasing in frequency at regular intervals. The output is simply the time at present minus the time at the key event, directly above the key event, which produces a set of linear points of the form f of x equals negative x. Since the present is taken to be 0, and the time before the present is taken as negative, taking the difference gives the negative of a negative, which gives us points above the x-axis. For key events to occur at regular intervals in this manner would imply a constant acceleration of development, a concept we will return to shortly. The relationship between the rate of development over time and the time between key events over time is an inverse one. As the time between key events decreases, the frequency or velocity, as it were, of key events increases in proportion. And again, over the full range of time, we predict that the velocity curve will have a general bell shape. Any event in time will have an output that lies somewhere on the line f of x equals negative x or f of x equals x. Now, as a solution to our problem that the logistic map cannot track developmental curvature because it employs an unknown variable, we adopt the following convention for the discrete linear difference function. We identify and plot a sequence of key events. We begin by going down by default from f of e sub n to f of e sub n plus 1 at a 45-degree angle. Then, if the time difference between two key events is less than in the previous instance, we will continue down by letting the most recent key event represent t equals 0 and subtracting the difference of a negative as before. But if the time difference is greater than in the previous instance, then we will go up by letting e sub p minus 1 represent t equals 0 and adding the difference from 0. In this way, the approximate point of inflection will be revealed over time, regardless of any minor deviations up or down. It's okay to have negative time. We simply want to avoid any negative time differences. And when the present is not set to 0, we must add from 0 in order to avoid this situation. Note that these two procedures are equivalent via the additive identity property. T equals 0 is not fixed. It floats in the sequence, just as the present moves forward. When considering the relationship between any two outputs in the plane, the relationship is never isolated, but must always be considered sequentially, observing the path rule at each event in between. Otherwise, the output height may be distorted. It is paramount to keep in mind that without the path rule, a reduction in frequency does nothing to the shape of the graph, and it remains a negative x line. Finally, If the time differences are equal, then we will alternate up and down at every other instance. Linear progression in development implies a constant velocity of events, no acceleration, and evenly spaced key events. But if the occurrence of key events is truly speeding up, then this must not be the case. A linear progression in velocity implies constant acceleration and a regular increase in the frequency of events. However, this must also not be the case. Otherwise, we could predict the occurrence of key events geometrically, and furthermore, every event would have to unfold like clockwork with no uncertainty. And since, until now, key events have evidently been occurring more frequently in general, then curvature is implied across the board. We introduce the squaring rule in order to answer the question of how far above the x-axis the output of the most recent key event resides. The squaring rule is defined in terms of the two most recent key events, is iterative, and is applied whenever and wherever the present is defined. While the greatest possible real output relates to the time between the first key event and inflection, the real output of any present key event is always zero, and so we use the squaring rule to generate the image output at present. The inflection event, by definition, will have the smallest image output. Note that the inflection event is a key event that is the inflection event by happenstance, that is, it is a key event first, and the inflection event by virtue of the timing of later key events. The squaring rule can be applied retroactively to any past key event E sub n. Say we choose a point E sub n in the past, and the preceding key event happened 24 hours before E sub n. Then, the squaring rule tells us that when E sub n was in the present, the image output of E sub n must have lied 24 hours above the x-axis. If we imagine starting from the next key event, E sub n plus 1, at say 24 hours in the future, and then let the E sub n plus 1 occur sooner and sooner in time after E sub n, we find that the new output, delta image of E sub n plus 1, collapses to 0 when E sub n and E sub n plus 1 occupy the same point in time. For the total output, f of E sub n, of a generic key event E sub n, we have a real component and an image component, as defined by the squaring rule. However, this is only an approximation. The exact expression for the function, as it turns out, is a little more involved. The x-axis is both the direction of primary time and also the point of singularity for the output of some event E sub n, and can only be reached if E sub n minus E sub n minus 1 is equal to 0, as we saw. The term E present is slightly oversimplified and should be taken to represent the most recent key event taken to approximate the present. E1 is of course a bookkeeping term that vanishes if we let E1 equal 0 time, but since we're letting t equals 0 float with E sub p or E sub p minus 1, the term E1 actually becomes irrelevant to the calculation as it is no longer needed as a frame of reference. It is important to keep in mind that the path rule causes the real output of an event to be less than or equal to E sub p minus E sub n. When the path zigzags up and down, the time between going up and down is canceled out in the calculation of the real output. So we need to think about how this can be formalized. Also, given our current definition of the squaring rule, It becomes necessary to view the termination line as localized and not absolute. Otherwise, we would see negative time differences in the case where key events began slowing and then sped back up for a long enough period of time such that their outputs fell below the previous termination line. For the sake of time concerns and the scope of this presentation, we will save the subject of a revised squaring rule and an absolute definition of the x-axis for the discrete linear difference function for another time. Please forgive me, because this presentation took several months to construct. In fact, production was stopped for 3 months from the previous slide in order to develop this discrete analysis to maturity. And in the process, my understanding became clearer over time. For starters, there is no need to revise the squaring rule. The simple fact is that the x-axis passes through the base of the square. If the square has 0 area, then the axis will pass through the lowest functional output itself. In a sense, we could think of the x-axis as being pushed down to a certain point as the function progresses, but it's best not to consider coordinates until the graph has been fully constructed. If you're confused, don't worry, because all will become clear shortly. So now we are in a position to present an exact expression for the discrete linear difference function. The function is more involved than originally anticipated, and I have had to work hard investigating and digesting all the particulars in order to bring them to you now in as succinct a manner as I am capable of presenting, and I would stand for nothing less. To begin, we have 4 main categories of interest. 1, the function rules that generate the graph. 2, the function itself, i.e., the compound procedure that calculates the output. 3, functional properties that are divided into those properties that are relevant to tracking development, and those properties that are more or less purely mathematical properties. And finally, general applications of the DLD function. This slide presents the choice rules. At the far left, we have the down by default rule. This rule sets the precedent for the graph by saying that we will begin with an angle of pi over 4 between the output of e sub 1 and e sub 2 and the baseline between e sub 1 and e sub 2, and that then the hypotenuse will be root 2 longer than the base, and of course this holds in general for all neighboring pairs in the sequence. The subscript runs from 2 up to the number of elements in the sequence. If the output were to be placed above e sub 2 instead of e sub 1, then the graph would be forced up by default. There's nothing necessarily wrong with this, but we choose this convention because it reflects Kurzweil's work. There is the left to right rule. This rule means that when we process a given sequence of data points in time, or whether they are simply a sequence of real numbers with no relation to history, we always begin with the third element in our sequence and proceed executing the path rule sequentially left to right till we come to the most recent or last element in the sequence for finite sequences. If we want to go backwards, from the most recent to the oldest or first element in a sequence, the graphs will not always be equal, because the path rule depends on the previous delta, which from left to right is to the left, and from right to left is to the right. In fact, the graphs are only equal for sequences possessing strictly decreasing delta, or at least sequences with no more than one equality case per decrease. When processing a sequence from right to left, we invert the down by default rule and use the up by default rule. The logic in giving preference to traveling left to right apart from being the direction in which we write in English, is that infinite sequences cannot be processed from right to left. Of course, we can reorient the direction of our expression of a sequence, but then the graph will only be a y reflection of the graph of the sequence from left to right, and not truly the reverse graph. Therefore, infinite sequences cannot have a right-to-left graph. For finite sequences, however, and in general, there should be a predictable and regular discrepancy for opposite directions. Though earlier in this presentation we talk about local zeros, we now adopt the origin rule, which sets e sub 1 at t equals 0, because it is more consistent with a growing sequence. It is also important that we distinguish between setting the origin in terms of our sequence and the origin of the Cartesian plane for the graph, through which each point in the sequence is transposed. We will talk more about the origin of our coordinate system soon, and we use delta notation for simplicity under the delta identity, although it may be clearer to retain difference notation in executing the function, and certainly in coding DLDF into software, we would not want to suffer any loss of information by oversimplifying a procedure. DLDF carries a necessary sequence condition, namely that each successive element in the sequence must be greater than or equal to the previous element, beginning of course with the second element and running up to the last. This condition follows naturally from having a sequence of key events in time that are not out of the order in which they occurred. In light of a timeline, it simply makes no sense to have a definite point in time occurring again at a later date. Disregarding the physical impossibility, from a functional standpoint, sequences of data points must be ordered in a non-decreasing fashion, otherwise there can be multiple outputs for a single input, unless we prevent this by requiring that sequences that are free to range in value can never repeat a value out of order. Remember, we need to be able to convert the sequence into something functional. Since the graph is discrete, and with the connecting line simply an aesthetic, the functional violation only happens in the case where distant elements in sequence are equal and produce different outputs, but not when a later element passes back across or comes arbitrarily near to a previous element. Discrete functions are free in this regard, and this is interesting because it gives rise to another idea, one for yet another discrete function, one that bijects in onto a unique subset of R. We call this new functional map combinatorial batch decimation, CBD. Look for more information on this function from me in the near future, hopefully by about March or even February of next year, 2018. To reiterate, we have of course the path rule, the quintessential rule of the DLD function, without which the graph of any sequence would be just a root 2x diagonal line. This isn't as complicated as it looks. We have notation for the open inequality between successive pairs of elements in sequence, given in difference notation and delta notation below it. The difference index runs from I equals 3 up to n, capital N, the number of elements in the sequence, and for delta notation, the index is shifted left 1. The path rule gives depth to a sequence and allows us to examine the trend in the frequency, so to speak, of the elements contained within from one pair of elements compared to the next pair. The equality rule, or third case of the path rule, because you're just going to have greater than, less than, or equal, and the equality rule, or the third case of the path rule, is a special case that I didn't consider at first, but it follows the down by default rule, going down for the first equality case, and for all instances with an odd subscript, so every other time. Whenever, however, we must be mindful because DLDF is split into seed and germ versions of divergence cases, and the reason for this is that after an initial divergence up, we must run a recursive procedure, the DLD function, that is defined by the height of the seed divergence. So it's like defined by the height of the seed divergence, and then it's germination. Germ is short for germination. It's germ from there, and then if the graph reaches or breaches the initial height of divergence, we call that a recovery, and the next divergence thereafter, if any, will be the next seed divergence. In the distinction of seed and germ equality cases, we let the germ equality index begin immediately after a seed divergence and have a reverse convention so that we travel up in the first equality case immediately after a seed divergence. And then this prevents the graph from continually or perpetually going down, and when elements in sequence are evenly spaced. So it's a limit on how far downwards a graph can go. And the equality rule has memory and applies across a sequence. So like in the seed case, it would pick up after a divergence, and so if you were already tracking an equality divergence, but it's on specific numbers, like for instance, if there was a single equality case of 5 equals 5 prior to divergence, and then you had a recovery, and then after recovering from the divergence, there was a second delta comparison case of 5 equals 5, then the graph would be forced up by virtue of the first case. So it's and then lastly, we would say that there will be arbitrarily many equality indexes for however many unique delta equalities occur in a sequence. Returning to the squaring rule, we begin with the minimum functional output. Visually speaking, it is that point on the graph that is the lowest point relative to the entire graph. It could be at the last element in the sequence, or it could be somewhere in the middle. Not every sequence will have an inflection point, but there will always be a lowest output. In a 2-element sequence, it will be at the f of e sub 2 by the default rule. If a sequence contains only one element, the graph will be a point at the origin. And for the empty set, the function is undefined. To identify the location for our square, apart from looking at the graph, we must realize that the smallest delta in a sequence doesn't necessarily correspond to the lowest point on the graph, and so we must choose simply the delta of the function min and not delta min per se. After identifying the correct location, we square off the x-axis below this point and add delta image to the output. Obviously, we want to pin the y-axis to the function min. This causes the element in the sequence that gives the min to reside at the origin of the Cartesian plane, which renormalizes this element, giving it a value of 0. We then arithmetically translate the elements in the sequence that come before and or after this element, fully embedding the sequence into the x-axis. Thus, the graphing process is not complete until the sequence has been expanded into the plane. We square off below f-min and finally embed the sequence into the x-axis. If the function minimum occurs at a point where 2 or more elements are found, then the difference, delta image, will be 0. This is novel because it means that the graph at its lowest point can touch the x-axis even with the squaring rule, but only if there are multiples of an element in sequence occurring at the function min. By definition, the DLD function gives the output height at E1 of a sequence according to a set of rules and in relation to the function minimum. The technique we use to accomplish this is to add all deltas and to then subtract out all the deltas and or portions of deltas that do not contribute to the output. One of the necessities in getting a valid procedure for this function is in ensuring that no deltas that need to be subtracted are subtracted more than once. So the order of operations is important. Furthermore, we need a recursive procedure capable of correctly tracking a divergent path and processing a recovery should one occur. To execute the DLD function, take the following steps. Step 1. Obtain a sequence of real numbers that satisfies the necessary sequence condition. Step 2. Graph the sequence using the rules provided. Step 3. Sum the sequence. Step 4. If the graph of the sequence is all down, then we're done, and S1 plus delta image is the function output at E1. If, however, the graph turns up even once, then there is work to be done in calculating the output by chiseling away at S1. Any divergence up must be subtracted in full from S1. However, we do not want to get ahead of ourselves by attempting to subtract all up cases at once. We want to proceed methodically from one divergence case to the next, never assuming in our procedure which way the graph is going to turn. We reflect on our function rules, and we realize that there are two divergence cases, one from the path rule proper, and the other from the equality rule, and that we can define these two divergence cases in the manner displayed. We can then define a divergent event as the E sub I in a divergent delta indexed in case 1 or case 2, exclusive or. With this in mind, we go from left to right, comparing deltas to previous deltas, beginning with delta 2 to delta 1, and selecting the first instance of divergence for subtraction. Then, subtract the first divergent delta from S1. Step 5. Once the first divergent delta has been subtracted from S1, again, we proceed with caution, assuming nothing about the direction of the graph. We keep track of the height of the graph after a divergence by introducing S2 equals 0 at the divergent event. We define the remainder R equals S2 minus the divergent delta. We also define the divergent or germ equality index for handling divergent equality cases. Step 6. Once our definitions have been made, we are prepared to process post-divergent deltas. Starting from E sub D sub 1, we know R is less than 0. We check to see if our seed divergence is less than, greater than, or equal to the next delta. If it is greater, then we subtract the second delta from S1 and add it to S2. If the seed divergence is less than the second delta, then we subtract the second delta from S1 and S2. If the seed divergence is equal to the second delta, then it will be the first germ equality case. So we know by default we will be subtracting it from S1 and S2. But if this occurs, remember, the next equality case of the same magnitude must be added to S2 regardless of whether it is consecutive and provided that R has remained less than 0. Step 7. Next, we come to the event immediately following the seed divergent event, E sub d plus 1. We know that R is still less than 0, and so we proceed to check the second delta against the third, delta sub d plus 2, using the same procedure. If the third delta is greater than the previous delta, we subtract it from S1 and S2. If it's less than the previous delta, then we subtract it from S1 and add it to S2. If equal, then run the equality index procedure. Step 8. Finally, we come to the second post-divergent event, E sub d plus 2. Now we have the full-blown recursive procedure operating. At this third iteration, it becomes possible for the remainder to be greater than 0, so we check the value of R. If R is greater than 0, then we have a recovery, and we add the remainder to S1, discard S2, discard germ equality indices, if any, and resume checking successive deltas for the next seed divergence up to the end of the sequence. If the next divergent event is found, subtract it from S1, reset S2 equals 0, and proceed as with step 6. Similarly, if R equals 0 at this point, it also qualifies as a recovery, but there is nothing to add, so we discard S2 and any germ equality index incurred, and resume checking for the second divergence case up to the end of the sequence. But if the remainder is still less than 0 at this point, then we check the third against the fourth delta and repeat the previous steps. This recursive procedure allows us to keep subtracting deltas from S1 as long as R is less than 0 at the beginning of each iteration, ad infinitum, or to the end of the sequence, or until we meet or breach the initial line of divergence when R becomes non-negative. For sequences with strictly increasing deltas, the remainder goes to negative infinity. When we have run the DLD function through the entire sequence, the tailored S1 is ready for the finishing touch that gives the output, and so we simply add delta image and we're essentially done, except that we like to give the output as a ratio between 0 and 1 of the raw length of the sequence. We will be returning to this once more shortly. Property 1. Basic symmetry. A result of the fact that events in time are not necessarily causally related is that some events will inevitably share a moment in time with no conflict. For the function, this means that if a sequence expresses this property, there will be no function inverse evaluated at such a point. When a data point appears more than once in a sequence, it must be consecutive, as determined by the necessary sequence condition, and subscripts must be arbitrarily assigned to these elements in such a way that preserves the regular element numbering. Thus, the DLD function can be either odd or even at any given point, depending on the sequence. The difference between a traditional even function, such as f of x equals x squared, and DLDF is that whereas with the former one is not certain which distinct x to which to turn from f of x, In DLDF dynamics, we can have a single output with arbitrarily many inputs with consecutive subscripts, all sharing the same value or position in the sequence. So again, there is that potential for not having a function inverse at certain points depending on the sequence. Property 1 leads to property 2, the surprise path rule, SPR, which serves to remind us that we do not overlook zero deltas in our path rule procedure. This rule concerns the comparison of non-consecutive deltas and was first realized when examining a test sequence that contained two equal deltas that had a zero delta between them. SPR is more of a reminder than something that needs to be stated in the general procedure, as it would only come into effect if we were attempting to run the path rule on a sequence with deltas out of consecutive order. SPR merely says that zero deltas are meaningful deltas and cannot be ignored or skipped in the path rule procedure, and that by extrapolation all deltas are meaningful deltas. All delta comparisons must be between consecutive deltas in the order in which their subscripts were assigned. Property 3. Step-by-step operation. The current method versus the old universal quantifier attempt. The first time I attempted to give an expression for the DLD function, I used universal quantifiers. Since all deltas are added at once, I reasoned that we could subtract all unneeded deltas out at once also. This turns out to be a clumsy and ineffective move. We really must distinguish between seed divergences and germ divergences, otherwise we can end up subtracting the same deltas twice, a showstopper. Once I had time to digest the significance of the recursive procedure, I realized it was too impractical to subtract all up cases at once, because this leaves one wondering how to deal with the remaining down deltas that do not contribute to the output height, but which must still be subtracted. With everything in perspective, I knew that a blind and unassuming step-by-step procedure was called for. Property 4. SSR. As previously stated, the squaring rule has the property of allowing only those sequences whose delta image equals 0 to touch the x-axis. All other sequences rest above the x-axis. In cases of the former, we must be mindful of the surprise squaring rule, which says that we do not square off from any equal element in sequence other than the one with the largest subscript. This avoids misplacing our square in front of or behind the equal elements at the function min. We want the square pinpointed on top of these elements. Therefore, we always square off from the equal element with the largest subscript. Property 5. The default direction chart. Study this direction chart and memorize the directional conventions. This exercise will allow us to wrap our minds around the conventions and to internalize the overall coherence of the general procedure. As previously stated, infinite sequences cannot be processed from right to left. This is apparent in the fact that there is no other end of the sequence from which to start, and that all we can do is y-reflect the graph. This is one limitation of infinite sequences, and there is another we will soon mention that definitively places finite sequences in favor of infinite sequences in terms of our primary goal of tracking human development. And no, it's not that we don't anticipate tracking events into the infinite future, however we do not, but there's still something else that ties back in with our assumptions about the nature of reality. Can you figure out what it is? When we consider comparing the magnitude of outputs between directions, the direction reversal from the default rule produces an open inequality between the output of the first element in forward order with the output of the last element in reverse order. We call this the alpha-omega inequality. Property 6. The never-ending function. The DLD function is recursive and can handle any countable sequence. In the case of infinite sequences, the function will be infinite in length because every output is calculated by processing every point along the graph that comes after it. If there is regularity, we may abbreviate with inductive notation, but for infinite sequences with irrationally increasing delta, there would be no choice but to run the function to infinity. There is some notion of the output of the last element in a finite sequence relating backwards to the lowest output if it isn't it, but here we actually recommend running f reverse and then using the alpha omega inequality. Property 7, a complementary function. There is another way to execute DLDF. Whereas in the traditional sense, we chisel away at the entire sequence, revealing the output, with DLDF complement, we build up to the output, so there is never anything to subtract. However, we must still use the step-by-step recursive procedure in order to determine what exactly needs to be added, because remember, recovery points on the graph are not always so easily determined by the naked eye. DLDF complement must still run the full length of the sequence, but has one less step every time DLDF traditional subtracts a delta from S1. So it may actually be the preferred version for coding DLDF into software, a subject we will return to shortly. Property 8. Divergent path law. This law follows deductively when considering the effect of the path rule on an initial divergence. I've hinted at it throughout this presentation, and it's very straightforward. If the first germ delta after a divergent delta were longer, it would also diverge up. The quickest possible recovery comes from having the first germ delta smaller than the divergent delta, and then also having the second germ delta slightly smaller than the first, such that they add up to a value greater than the initial divergence. Property 9, DLDF procedural amendment and the surprise squaring rule 2. We want to be explicit about every necessary procedure in the function. Although we have covered the squaring rule extensively in this work, we still haven't said everything that needs to be said about it. As you know, we look for the lowest point on the graph, that is, we find the element in sequence that yields S1 equals 0. We observe the delta of that element, or elements, in sequence, and then add the value of this delta to S1. Yes, multiple elements in sequence can correspond to the lowest point on the graph, but the thing not yet mentioned or considered is that this can occur for sequences in general, not just for instances where equal delta happen to hit the same low point, and that this property, when expressed, can lead to squares of different sizes. In cases such as these, we choose the smallest square to add to S1, thus completing the functional procedure. Property 10. The DLDF ratio. Although it is possible to run the function on any element in a sequence, our focus is on the global graph. And to look at this, we need the first element. And while occasionally we may be able to shortcut the function with Pythagorean geometry, doing this can easily create an unknown variable in the case where we skip over a bunch of transitions in the graph, but are left wondering where our breach point has taken us. The DLD function is rigorous and for good reason, and as promised, we have returned to our presentation of the output as a ratio of the gross length of the sequence. We call this the DLDF ratio. Recall, we said that only a sequence possessing strictly decreasing delta produces a graph that is all down, as we say, and realize that apart from sequences possessing only two non-equal elements, being all down is the only way the ratio can achieve a maximum value. Note that when delta image equals 0, the maximum reduces to 1. Achieving a maximum value does not have the same meaning, however, as in the archaic, continuous logistic function model in which an output of 1 implies maximum development. Here it merely tells us about the behavior or progression of the sequence. The smallest the DLDF ratio can be is an arbitrary value strictly greater than 0, as determined by the default rule and the stated condition that E sub n be strictly greater than E sub 1. We call the characteristic the DLDF function tests for compounding, and we say that the function gives us information about how consistently events have compounded in sequence without speaking to the magnitude of compounding. Note that there is not a direct relationship between the consistency in divergences and the value of the output. For example, consider a sequence in which half of delta therein are divergent. Just because a graph is divergent half the time does not imply that the output of the first element will be half the gross length of the sequence. In truth, it means that the functional output will be strictly less than 1/2 of delta gross because the path rule dictates that all divergent delta will be longer than the delta that preceded them. Property 11, 989 sequences, and the preference of finite sequences. We designed the DLD function so that not just any sequence could produce an all-down graph. Recall the reversed convention for germ equality cases. Practically speaking, even a graph that is all down must terminate. Once we get down to measurements at the level of their own uncertainty, there is nothing the graph can do but stabilize into a regular zigzag pattern. So there will always be a practical limit on how far a graph can drop. Now, as it turns out, mathematically speaking, there is a type of sequence that produces an infinite output. We call this type of sequence a 989 sequence. In the example provided, we can see that the deltas produced from the sequence are strictly decreasing, so the graph will be all down by the path rule, but each successive delta will always stay above 1, so the output of any data point we choose will always diverge to infinity. Recall that we have taken steps to guard against negative time differences. In fact, this was the inspiration for the squaring rule. Negative time differences are fine in terms of setting up a coordinate system, sure, but in terms of logic and nature, we take it that all real-time intervals must be non-negative. If we follow the convention that negative time differences are to be avoided, and this is interesting, we realize that a 989 sequence produces what we call an exploded graph, that is a graph with no origin. Since there is no lowest point on the graph, if we set an origin point, then any point that we may choose would cause negative time differences to occur below it. Therefore, the origin must reside at a point that is infinitely distant from the output of the first element in sequence. Contrasting this phenomenon with what we are most interested in, we see that infinite sequences are inconsistent with our assumptions about finite complexity in nature. If there are only finitely many developments to be made, and if we model this with an infinite sequence, we would have an infinite tail of meaningless data points after the final element in sequence. Therefore, we must conclude that although the function can handle an infinite sequence, we can relax because We're just not anticipating having that many elements to work with, and even if we were, it's practically impossible to have that many. For even as it is implied by Ray Kurzweil himself in The Singularity is Near, in estimating the raw number of events since the Big Bang, it is a finite value. Conceptualization and applications. In order to connect with DLDF on a conceptual level and to gain some familiarity or fondness for DLDF, it is perhaps useful to employ a couple of analogies. DLDF, if utilized properly, can have predictive power. What we're trying to accomplish is something like in meteorology, where meteorologists attempt to predict the weather with past weather patterns and some well-developed notions of fluid dynamics, or the way in which parents will keep track of the height of their growing children by marking and labeling notches on the wall in the kitchen, a sentimental and socially binding practice as old as the hills. The difference is, instead of measuring the growth of a single child, in a major respect, we're serious about keeping track of the growth of humanity as a whole, and then making better projections for our height in the future. DLDF has great utility. Broadly speaking, there are 5 categories of applications of the function. They include 1. Consumer profiling. For example, researchers may wish to compare how often people frequent a certain restaurant or place of business. Data can be generated by survey or collected organically over time by monitoring a test group for shopping habits. The results are deductive. Data collected may not be entirely accurate, but this is a separate issue, and how one chooses to interpret and act upon data is a free choice. But in general, DLDF can be used to enhance the effectiveness of consumer profiling by adding depth to trends in consumer behavior. This can translate to a bigger bottom line in the right hands and under the right circumstances. Category 2. Psychological studies. In compulsive behavioral studies, subjects can be monitored over time and data collected for analysis. DLDF then expands graphically and functionally a sequence of data points of, for instance, gambling or drug use over, say, a 10-year period. How regular was the compounding of the behavior? Did the frequency level out or slow down, etc.? DLDF makes these sorts of questions easier to answer than looking at things one-dimensionally, which in some sense handicaps our perspective. Therefore, more accurate medical diagnoses may be made with DLDF, improving the quality of families and lives, and perhaps even saving a few. Category 3. Stock and currency exchanges. DLDF is also yet another tool that can be used for trying to stay ahead of the stock market. This has both short and long-term connotations. In the short term, it means providing some supplemental context to the raw number of trades that are occurring over time, helping to identify value spikes before they happen. In the long term, it means having a serious advantage over other investors in the case where the curvature in innovation begins showing its logistic side, as this will signal a reduction in the diversity of hot new options, increasing the explosive potential for any new vehicles that emerge. Category 4. General scientific applications. For any physical process that can be analyzed discretely, for any instance in which we wish to monitor the frequency of data points, DLDF is useful. For example, in the study of bees, or fish, or birds. Moving from point A to point B, sensors can be used to track the movement or migration of animals over time, generating data sequences and then running DLDF on the data. If the movements of animals are better understood, conservation efforts may improve. Other natural or biological processes can also be studied. Category 5. Human development itself. Finally, and as you know by now, the original purpose of DLDF is to track and predict the rate of human development. Granted, the definition of key events we use is somewhat arbitrary, but here consistency is more important than the exact definition upon which we settle. As it may be more revealing, I recommend looking at subsets of key events, or ones that are class-specific. For instance, we might focus on innovations in communication or transportation over the course of human history, looking for slowing trends. In the case of communication, we would have elements in sequence representing things like the emergence of vocalization in vertebrates, proto-language in hominids, sign language, language proper, drums, various musical instruments, written language, and cryptography, yodeling, smoke signals, carrier pigeons, phones and cell phones, email, and quantum entanglement machines, etc. If we can better understand our own development, it will let us peer behind the curtain, so to speak, to behold deeper and deeper truths about ourselves. The Study of Human Development Project and a Call to Action. If you're tantalized by the possibilities and you would like to get involved with what we are dubbing the Study of Human Development Project, whose stated goal is to further the human understanding of ourselves and our place in the future, we are gladly considering connections with interested parties, calling all software engineers, investors, partners, contractors, consultants, PR spokesmen, advertising agents, from patent attorneys to fans to spread the links. We're talking the whole 9 yards, and without your help, it cannot be realized. It is my dream to see the Study of Human Development Project incorporate and become a successful business. Once the software has been produced, and we'll need to decide if we're going to use an open source code or not, but we can then sell our data analysis tool to research groups all over the world with respect to the 5 applicable categories I previously listed. And, if all goes well, we may even be in a position to receive federal funding to do our own research on human developmental curvature, the big enchilada, as we anticipate a surge of public support once the project gets up and running. The sheer scope, appeal, and mystique of the project will capture the public's imagination, allowing us to quite possibly grow into a global project because measuring how much we're growing as a species is something that parents and knowledge seekers around the world will appreciate. The social impact. Let us imagine for a moment that we are in the near future, DLDF has been coded into software, and the Human Development Project has just succeeded in showing deceleration in a number of important categories of human development. And the study has made the news worldwide. Researchers find evidence that human technological development is slowing down. Now, if such a scenario were to play out, what might be the impact of such a revelation? Would there be panic in the streets, as in the case of some catastrophic and impending meteor impact? Would the very fabric of society break down, as some believe would occur in the case of ET disclosure? Ray Kurzweil might be upset, but on the contrary, this news would have a sobering, tempering, and stabilizing effect overall on us because fewer people would be engaged in short-term speculation and trying to step over others in order to reach a finish line of perfection that is much more distant than it appears. There may be some apprehension about a diminishing status quo, and as I indicated, enhanced demand on new tech trading. However, logistic development is anti-apocalyptic because it implies that the end is not nigh, and this will be a relief to many, and still a disappointment to others. Not simply from a religious or philosophical point of view, but from the point of view of those who might seek to capitalize on crisis scenarios. Still, a non-crisis could in itself constitute a crisis of sorts, so we'll just have to wait and see. Speaking for myself, I feel that knowing that we have a long way to go in becoming masters of the universe will at once allow us to take a step back and appreciate all the progress we've made, and at the same time instill in us the discipline and perseverance needed to run the race all the way to its glorious climax. Thus we have attempted to outline a comprehensive model for human development that advises caution when it comes to anticipating an ever-quickening rate of development. We began with the work of Ray Kurzweil as a staging point, and argued that finite complexity in nature, if the case, implies a finite totality of developments to be made, which in turn implies logistic curvature, followed by discretization and logistic mapping thereof. We explained how logistic mapping proves to be ineffective, and that a new discrete system was needed. We then conceived this system, developed it, explained the rules, procedure, properties, and applications, and even proposed a plan for forming a business around this system with the potential to change the world. Thank you.